God's blessings extend to forever. How God works. In the midst of this series, it reflects upon the passages we find in the pages of the Old Testament, which of course has nothing to do with us because we are in the 21st century. Oh, but a matter of fact, it does when you look at it. You'll find this central, clear truth laid out for us in this passage that's noted there in the worship bulletin that you received as you came in the door. How odd that in Southwest Florida, by the way, this is how I have a new criteria for knowing that it's summertime in Southwest Florida. When services started, I was able to sit on the back row. How about that? That was amazing. The back row was even empty this morning. This is summertime in Southwest Florida, and there's a lot of good things about it. I got to sit on the back row. That was a kind of a yay. Okay, I'm done with that. Here we go. How God works. God's blessings extend to forever. And when he extends them in that particular way, I would want you to also know a kind of a extra phrase to go along with it, and it's this: God's blessings exceed the ordinary and rise to the level of spectacular. When we think about how God works in our lives, blessings are no small part of that awareness. I want to ask you something. When you buy a piece of clothing, how long do you plan on it lasting? Now, I know some of you guys have 25-year flannel shirts, right? You know the kind, I have a couple of these, the kind that somebody in your life thinks that you should eliminate. I mean, the kind, you know, where the collar stuff kind of gets worn all through. I mean, my phrase at my house is, it's just broken in when the collar stuff starts to wear all the way through. Okay, ladies, I didn't mean to beat you up there too much. But I would ask you then, realistically, when you buy something new, no matter what it is, from a car to a piece of clothing, to shoes for your feet, to something for your home, what is your expectation that it will last forever? Well, you really don't, do you? We're not accustomed to that. I mean, we'd like warranties or guarantees, but the concept of forever is a bit of a strange explanation. I mean, people who are merchants try to demonstrate to us that their products will last for a long time, but I really don't always buy that. I'd offer you the opportunity this morning, not myself offer you the opportunity, I'd point out to you that it's available to be in the only enterprise that has forever as part of its name, and it's meant that way. Forever? Forever. Can we do a little bit of the hallelujah chorus thing there? I mean, I wish I had that great bass or tenor voice to sing forever, forever, forever. You know how that line goes and all that kind of that echoing stuff around the room? The only enterprise in the universe that God has set in plan and into motion that will last forever. Because I have a hunch that most of us would like our personal influence to last for a few days. I mean, I don't know about you, but I'd like the things that I value, the things that I believe are true, the things that are holy and decent and just and righteous, to be a part of my family for quite a few generations. And so when I look at my own life and I'm thinking about, how is God going to work this so that the things that he says are of value, that I agree with him on that are of value, how does God work all that out? Aha. That's why we're in this passage from this Old Testament text that we know as 1 Chronicles chapter 17, verses 16 through 27 this morning. God's blessings to a person then, and as they appear. God's blessings to a person come to David. See, David is this guy in the long ago of God who has been selected to be a key and chief player in the enterprise. David will be involved not only in the military conquest and setting up in the generations of his family the details that God has laid out, but he will also be the father to the son who will be apparently the wisest person in the history of the world, whose name is Solomon, who will also be the builder of the temple of God. Remember, David wanted to build it, and God said, no, that's not your task. But your task is to be involved in this creation of this son and his raising and his upbringing. David's choice gives us, the choice of David gives us some particular insight then on how God's blessings extend forever and how they come to a particular person. If you want to note these there, then this is the first part, excuse me, of the fill-in-the-blank outline in the worship bulletin. David is chosen by God not because of his age. See, some choices in our world are made because of how old you are. Either you are not old enough or you are too old. I remember when I hit 55 and I suddenly qualified for senior coffee at McDonald's. I don't drink coffee. There's another benefit that I didn't need. So, and I come upon it in that way. See, David, when he was chosen by God, was a young man. Can I use this great old word? He was a strapling. He was just a glimmer of what he would someday be. And some might think, well, God primarily uses young people then. But on the other hand, then there's that story in the Old Testament text about this guy named Moses. And God didn't get serious with Moses until he was at the big 80. Do you have a lot of people who have celebrated 80 in your family? Not all families have people that live to 80 years. And God became serious with Moses when he was 80. I wonder how that turns the idea. See, God chooses not because of age. Oh, look at the second point here. Not because of physically imposing appearance. God doesn't choose David because he's a gigantic youth or has big biceps or because he's strong. God looks beyond those things. Number 3, I'm going to go a little more quickly. Do you get the sense? Is that okay? God does not choose David because everybody in his family loves him. As a matter of fact, David has a dysfunctional family. But everything in your family always works wonderfully, right? So there's never any issue, so that's not a problem with you. So you have those first 3. God's blessings come to a person, but they don't come because of age, not because of physically imposing appearance, not because of acceptance in the family. Number 4, but absolutely based in the sovereign choice of God. See, God is absolutely sovereign. When he blesses those whom he chooses. You don't decide and I don't decide. God may choose to bless in a spectacular way, but I will tell you this. Number 5, it's always within the covenant. Within the covenant, see, there is a promissory relationship here at work when God's blessings come to this way. So my central question out of this text then becomes this way. Does God continue to work through specific individuals in the area of Christ's covenant? See, I understand. God chose David, put him in place. The kingdom is built. The temple will be built in Solomon's reign. I got that. But what I want to know, does it make sense to you? Does God choose people in the same way? I mean specific individuals to bless in dramatic ways so that his people and the world are impacted and a dramatic difference actually made? I believe the answer to the question is yes. A contemporary explanation. Some of you in this room were alive during the presidency of Richard Milhous Nixon. Is that true? Others of you can read about him in the history books. You know that a president does not serve alone, but is surrounded by a close cadre of comrades in arms who will defend and protect that president and all of the agendas that that president sets in place. Oh, thank you so much for the cough drop. It's helping wonderfully. One of the chief people who stood beside then President Nixon was Charles Colson. Charles Colson was the man who became the worst nightmare for the Democratic National Committee. He was the man who led, organized, and strategized almost all of the so-called dirty tricks campaigns against Nixon's opponent in the last election. They convicted Charles Colson. of wiretapping and other illegal activities, and they sent him to prison. Now imagine, you've risen, you've gone through college and law school, you've risen in the ranks of political power, and you have free access to the most powerful political office in the world. And what happens to you? You end up in federal prison. That is a phrase of how the mighty have fallen. Yet listen to Charles Colson's phrase. The great paradox of my life is this. Every time I walk into a prison now and see the faces of men and women who have been transformed by the power of the living God. See, Charles Colson received that which we would call jailhouse religion. He got it. People usually use that term in a very negative, he just got jailhouse religion, just trying to get a sentence license. But sometimes, in that context, people do become converted. Not little fakey stuff, not around the edges, I mean on the money converted. Listen to Colson. I realize that the thing that God has chosen to use in my life is none of the success, achievements, degrees, awards, honors, or cases that I won before the Supreme Court. See, he also had reached the level as an attorney that he was trying cases before the Supreme Court. You realize how the mighty have fallen? That's not what God's using in my life. What God is using in my life is my ability to touch the lives of literally thousands of other people in the fact that I was a convict and I went to prison. That was my great defeat. The only thing in my life I didn't succeed in. See, it didn't look like a blessing. Have you ever had things that you happened to? You said, why did that have to happen to me? We think that blessings are all peace and milk and honey and harmony along the side. But as a matter of fact, Charles Colson, God intervened in my life and brought me a blessing in the greatest catastrophe in the political scene during the presidency of Richard Nixon. The Watergate break-ins and all the other details of life surrounding him. When your life some days feels more like a curse than a blessing, you ever been there? When your life some days feels more like a curse than a blessing, you might be tempted to say, well, I know God blessed David, but he hadn't blessed me lately. I would ask you to imagine that you have a script that's just been handed to you. Imagine, now you guys have to go along with this. Ladies, you can figure this one out. Imagine you've just had a baby, and you were just handed a script for her life. And here are all the details of her life. And you have the ability, with an eraser in hand, to eradicate the struggles of life. A little bit larger nose than necessary in the view of her peers. Would I leave that or would I take that away? Oh, I see a marriage here coming along the way. But after the marriage, there's a very painful separation. I wonder if I would leave that or take that away. And after the separation, there's a significant stress-related illness that happens. I wonder if I should leave that or take that away. I think too often what I would do is I would take the eraser and I would change the shape of the nose so that she wouldn't be picked on in her growing up years. I would certainly eliminate the painful marriage separation. And disease is never a good thing. But God's blessings sometimes come to us in the midst of what we perceive to be a curse, not a blessing, as a matter of fact. But I would want you to observe that God is not in the business of removing all the stress of your life. That's not God's task. God never signed you up so he would say, and I will take all the stress out of your life. I will eliminate all your problems. I believe that some of the best problems we have to face are, as a matter of fact, could you say that, Andy? Charles Colson. I mean, Charles Colson, he said it. If he works that way at a dramatic level as that, God's blessings to persons happen, but we don't always perceive them as blessings until perhaps after the fact. God's sovereign vision for us may include details that we find objectionable and, frankly, look more like Christ's life than we can care to imagine. God's blessings also come to the people in this passage. In this First Chronicles story here, then, God's blessings come to the people. The Jerusalem is going to be built. The temple is going to be erected. The Ark of the Covenant is going to be placed. The Holy of Holies will be established within the temple. The great high priest will be able to enter into the Holy of Holies once a year. Maybe you know a lot about this. Maybe you don't know anything about it. But it's the great sacrificial system that God had set in place to provide for the redemption, for the forgiveness of the sins of the people until the time of Messiah would come. And we can do the same kind of reflection. We all want to ask, of course, the key question, but first the reflection on the text. God's blessings to the people then, and it's God's choice involved with Israel. Now, God did not choose these people to work with to be the blessing because they were numerous. If you want to fill in the blanks again, here they come. God did not choose them because they were greatly numerous, because there were thousands upon thousands of these people. So he chose Israel because they were the largest group of people available. In fact, there was one of them, two if you count Sarah. He said, I chose you when there was no people to choose. Abram was the first man to be called a Hebrew in the history of the world. He's the very first one. And there was how many of him? That would be one. Hard to get a smaller group than that, isn't it? So God's blessings to people don't come because of great numbers. God's blessing to people did not come because they were wealthy and landowners in that time. It wasn't that God said, here, I'm going to find this wealthy group of people, and they have great lands and great prosperity and great means of production, and they are the ones who I will bless. It wasn't because of that. It did not choose them because they were a strategic military power. I mean, if you wanted to choose an ally, wouldn't it make sense to choose someone who is militarily strong? If the military conquest of the day is the primary issue, say yes and you'll be right. Because I'm dead on this. My throat is ever so much better. Can you tell? I'm in love with this idea of having a cough drop. Those three things then are characteristics then of what God did not use to choose them with. And it was again absolutely the sovereign choice of God to choose the people of Israel. He chose them. They did not choose him. We say this in the days of Christ. He loved us before we knew him. That's the idea of God's blessings. And again, it is always within the covenant. This time, it's not the covenant established but through Moses, the great lawgiver, but now in our era, it is the covenant that comes to us through Christ. Look, I'm trying not to walk in the summertime as if there's nothing going on. And admittedly, this may be some of the deep waters of Bible's understanding for you if you've not walked in this arena before. But these are some of the great truths of God that flow out of the passage. And what I want to know, again, is this. Does God's blessing have an end there in the pages of the Old Testament? Or does God's blessing continue to work in what we know as the 21st century? And does it extend to groups of people? In our era, does God directly work with people? And I believe the answer again is yes, he does. We believe this to be true. In fact, I want to show you a picture from a guy who tried to picture this, and he has a very simple life. This is a throne. I'm going to read what he titled it. This man titled this, "The Throne of the Third Heaven of the Nation's Millennial General Assembly." This is one man's vision of what heaven looks like. There are 180 pieces in the arrangement, from tables to chairs to small decorative items, all purposely pulled together by James Hampton, a quiet, virtually unknown janitor from the Washington, D.C. area, who worked on this for 20 years. Now, you may not know, and it's not immediately obvious, and I wish the quality of the photograph did more justice to the appearance of the actual objects themselves. All these pieces were made from cast-off items: old furniture, gold and aluminum foil, store displays, bottles, cigarette boxes, wine bottles, rolls of kitchen foil, used light bulbs. Are you getting excited now? Some of you who garage sale think, oh, right, this guy, I love this guy. Used light bulbs, cardboard, insulation board, construction paper, desk blotters, sheets of transparent plastic, all precariously held together with glue, tape, tack, and pins, no baling wire need apply. And on the bulletin board next to his creation, which no one saw for 20 years, were these words. It's found in Proverbs chapter 29, verse 18. Where there is no vision, the people perish. See, when we have this vision that God blesses people, I mean, not just kind of says, you know, go find half-price hamburgers today. Or Dairy Queen's having a special and you didn't know it, I'm going to bless you. Or to a group of people, I'm just going to kind of take care of you folks, and I'm going to get you out of a shopping center and get you to a nice place on Kilpatrick Road. You think that that's where God's blessings start and stop? Oh, come now, friends. God's blessings extend to forever. For you as a person, for us as his people. It's not some small little touch. It's the blessings of Almighty God. And with that vision in mind then, in our families and in our churches, we want to pass on this great vision of what it means. And my emphasis today, I believe that's drawn from this passage, has to do with how does one pass on this vision. Dietrich Bonhoeffer died during the reign of the Nazis. He was hanged just before the liberation of the city where he was held captive. In reflection, someone was talking with members of his family, asking him how this Lutheran pastor was able to stand up against the ravages of Nazis in Germany in that day. And the individual said, you know, I don't know. But maybe it has to do with the way that Dietrich Bonhoeffer grew up. If that's a new name to you, I'd encourage you to write it down or see me about the correct spelling or Google that up. Some of his things are incredibly profound. Here it all comes together. Bonhoeffer's family would often do this. Watch. How do blessings come to families? How do blessings come to groups of people? I'll show you. In Bonhoeffer's growing up days, his father would often read to the children some of the great heroic stories of people caring for other people. They would recite the stories until they would be understood at the level of the children. In Bonhoeffer's prison cell, which was discovered after he had been killed, he was reading the lives of Plutarch, which is an old book, but it describes the heroic actions of people. So when I began to think, how do we inherit this blessing? How do we see it in my family and your family? This is my vision. See if this makes sense to you and how you might pass on these visions. First thing I would do is I would tell the great stories of God. If I wanted to pass the vision on to my children and grandchildren and to generations of my family yet unborn, I would tell them the great stories of God. I would tell them about David, and I'd tell them about Noah, and I'd tell them about Solomon. I'd tell them how God accepted Rahab and embraced her, how he brought Deborah into the fold, how he put Esther in place for such a time and hour as this, how he called Mary and Joseph. I would tell them the great stories of God that are set out in the pages of his word. I would tell them the great stories of God's people, of people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and other people that I've known over the years, so that they would understand how these things truly do come together. Tell them the great stories of God. Tell them the great stories of God's people. Tell them the great stories of the Bible. I would lay it out. I mean, I wish I had the creativity to tell them Noah's Ark story like Bill Cosby did once long ago with Voompa, Voompa, it's the Lord, Noah. And I'd have those kids ready to be involved so that the children in your family, so that they grow up thinking, wow, God's blessings extend forever. I would tell them the great contemporary stories. I'd tell them the stories of the missionaries who went to China with the inland mission and whose presence now 100 years later is still being felt as there is a religious revival of the things of Christ occurring in what was formerly a communist-held country, perhaps because of the influence of the China Inland Mission. I would tell them the story of Chuck Colson, that people can rise to incredible heights of power in our country and have political influence, and they can crash and burn, and suddenly their whole life can be changed in an understanding that Christ accepts us all. What a wonderful story. And then I would tell them your story. I'd make it personal. I would take those 5 strategies to pass the vision on in my family. In fact, I don't have another cough drop, but I've got a glass of water that's about halfway here, okay? No, I understand. I'm very sympathetic. And I would tell the story personally. And as I said to you last week, this is the way that I pass it on personally in my family. I say to them now, not my children who are well into their 4th decade, but to my grandchildren, your grandmother and I have always found God to be faithful. That's part of my telling of the story. Friends, I want to tell you this, and I mean it from the sincerest way that I possibly can. Half-hearted vision and mediocrity doesn't inspire anybody. If you want to pass vision on in your family, in the people with whom you live in this 21st century, don't tell it in a half-hearted way. Give it the excitement. Give it the best you've got. Crank it up to that highest level of communication and bring all that you can to the party. To your nieces, to your nephews, to just children in the neighborhood that you have a chance to influence. Let them hear those great stories that flow out of all the rich resources that you have. And then, of course, at some point, pass on your vision. Because here's the great news. God's blessings extend to forever. You want to pray with someone before you leave this morning? You want to make that decision to follow Christ in your life? You want to actively seek those blessings of God? I'd be glad to share that time of prayer with you this morning. Others will stop and pray with you as well. If I miss you this morning, please follow up with me in the course of the week. And we can have a conversation that doesn't really lend itself to happening on Sunday morning. I encourage you to stop and pray and make decisions for Christ before you go. If you have something particularly troubling in your family, some struggle that you're going on, you don't need to walk up front and pray with me about it. You just stop as you stand and as we hold hands with one another, and you voice your own prayer to God and say, Father, I'm here today. And I do need to be blessed by you. And I've come seeking your blessings. You will too find. Oh, I just tell you this way. Nancy and I have always found God to be faithful. We believe he's the only enterprise who lasts forever. Let's stand together. At the close of worship, on Sunday morning, we stand together and hold hands. And we do simply to encourage one another that we don't stand alone, but that we stand with others in this enterprise together as we seek God's blessings and wisdom in our lives. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for your guidance and your wisdom. Watch over us in this coming week. May your insight and vision truly become ours as we seek to follow you all the days of our lives until at last you call us to your side. And all God's people prayed together and said, Amen. Have a blessed week, friends. Oh.